help us make sense of their latest survey. We're joined by Dr. Robin Garcia, President and CEO of WR Numero Research and Advisory Group. Dr. Robin, nice to talk to you again.
Hi, Ron. Good afternoon. Happy to be here.
We have lots to unpack here, but I do want to ask you first about the public's support for these specific camps. We have the Duterte camp with 37% of Filipinos identifying with it, and then we have 20% for Leni Robredo and about 18% with the opposition or the Marcos camp. The Duterte camp remains the single largest political faction, but it's still far from a majority. It's not over 50%. Is it fair to say that with this picture, the political landscape remains very open, despite one camp leading with about 20 percentage points?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. So I think you're referring to our factional partisanship data.
Yes.
So 37% are pro-Dutertes, but you can also see that more than 24%, I think around 24%, do not identify with any of the political factions.
Right.
So I think increase in support for the Dutertes as well. And so you can see this upward trend even in the presidential race, which we can tackle later. But in terms of factions, it tells you a lot of things about the current polarization of the Philippines, about the political base of that potential presidential candidates will draw from. So you can see that because 37% support the Dutertes, it does correlate directly to the level of support that Sara Duterte got in this particular poll, which is around 39%, so a little just over the 37% factional support for the Dutertes. So that's the conclusion, is that you can see that factional support is one of the most important variables determining the level of support for individual candidates that we included here. But the real headline here, Ron, is that both Sara Duterte and Leni Robredo are the two biggest gainers in this Q2 poll. So it means that when there's a growth in terms of support for them. In fact, Leni Robredo has increased a little bit and moved away from Raffy Tulfo, who she was tied with in previous polls, not just for this one, not just for the March poll that we released, but also in last year. So in the last year polls that we released. So it means that whatever Leni Robredo is doing, whether or not there's some more supporters that are egging her to run, I think you can see this in this poll. And you can also see the growth in Sara Duterte's numbers, even if she is the front runner. You can see that I don't think you can conclude that she will necessarily win the 2028 election. There's a lot of people who are still undecided, who don't identify with the Dutertes, and are also undecided about the presidential race.
I'll have more questions about the undecided or those who chose none of the above in a bit. But just going back to the public support for specific camps, it wouldn't be hard to notice that a combination of the numbers of Marcos and Robredo would almost match with the numbers of Duterte. I know it's still a couple of years away. We're talking about the elections, but could the thought of a team up in the next elections be already in each group's minds for now? Already?
Yeah, so I'm sure you're talking about the Uni-Pink, as we can label the Uni-Pink coalition, if ever that's possible. So if you add the political base of the Marcoses at around 18%, and those who identify themselves with liberal progressives at 20%, if you add that can match that's almost 40% of Sara Duterte's numbers. So definitely possible. And we're not even talking about the 2% that Bam Aquino and Rizon Tiveros received in this particular poll. We used to ask we used to have a longer list of 12 names, but this is 6 names, and basically these are the potential front runners. But there's a lot of issues when it comes to forming a coalition. So for instance, the first thing you need to think about is within your coalition, within the liberal progressive coalition, are you united, or are there potential splinter groups, or potentially that you won't unite? I know that this is a very important conversation for the liberal progressive faction, and that they're trying to replicate what you call a primary in the United States. Parang mag-uusap muna sila and they will nominate a common candidate. I think that at this point it's very crucial, even before they talk about a coalition between the Pinks and the Marcos administration. Within the Marcos administration, actually, sabi ko kanina, we used to ask more number of names, 12 names. We included yung mga matunog doon sa Marcos na potential standard bearers, including Vince Dizon, including DILG Secretary John Vic Remulla, even Secretary Angara, as well as si MMDA General Manager Nick Torre. We included him, and unfortunately, parang they're not doing as well as the other names here. So that's why we chose not to include them. So what we see here is that it's definitely possible to have a coalition, and it will be competitive in the 2020 election, but there's a lot of political realities that they will have to overcome in the short term.
And there still is uncertainty, if you can call it that, both for the factional partisanship and the presidential preference. We have Mrs. Robredo saying that she's not running. She doesn't want to run. And that's going to affect the numbers for both if there is going to be any definite, the definitive statement or the former vice president really deciding that she is not going to. Are the numbers transferable though? If Mrs. Robredo says this will be the person to run for me or for our group, would the numbers stand?
Everyone asks us that actually. So the quick answer is not necessarily. So we need to look at the dispersal of votes, no? So and the way you can do that is not only running a hypothetical question, but also asking if this candidate, your first choice candidate, will not run, who is your second choice? Actually, what we see is that across all of these, across the two top contenders of Vice President Sara Duterte and then former Vice President Leni Robredo, Raffy Tulfo always comes out as the top second choice of these people who would vote for either of these two, no? And so the answer is it won't necessarily disperse to those who are endorsed, no, by the candidate. So for example, if Leni Robredo endorses Bam Aquino, yes, a big chunk of the votes may transfer to Bam, but not necessarily so. Some of them will choose to vote for Risa or to vote for Raffy Tulfo. And so that's something that they will have to contend with. And of course, I think yung hinihintay ni Vice President Leni, we've been hearing the past few months that she might run. Of course, we're just observers. These are not confirmed. But perhaps it would benefit her to wait for the impeachment proceedings, how that might unfold. Because if Vice President Sara Duterte gets convicted and is not able to run in 2028, then the landscape will definitely open up and change for her. So.
Okay, in two parts of your survey again, both showing for the factional partisanship and for the presidential preference, there are those who are undecided and those who chose none of the above between Duterte, Marcos, and Robredo. For the factional partisanship, that number was as high as, I believe, 40% late last year, November 2025, and it has just gone down to 24%. So who gained from November until now? Where did those people go? Who did they choose?
Very good, very sharp observation, Ron. So I think across all of the results, we've seen that actually this is evidence that we're becoming more polarized. We've seen gains for the liberal progressives, we've seen gains from the Marcoses, but also some gains dispersed towards the Dutertes. No, so all of them slightly increased. And so basically, these undecideds, the moderates, are choosing sides already. And we can see why. And that's because of the impeachment. That's because of the ICC impending investigations, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, you also have what people feel about the direction of the country.
Right.
So as you can see, you saw a decrease in support for Marcos and the dissatisfaction for Marcos. And the biggest gainers are also those who are not necessarily Marcos, see Duterte and the liberal progressives. And I think it's this material anxiety on the part of Filipinos, those who support the Marcoses, and suddenly they basically disperse towards supporting other factions. No? So I think that's what we see. And these are structural realities of the world, but also that obviously the Iran war is something that the president cannot control, but the response to that is something that you can control. As we saw in the SONA, that's something that he's intentionally trying to solve. But really, Ron, I think when you mention those numbers, including those who are undecided, those who don't identify themselves with anyone, another important statistic is whether they can still change their minds about who they will support for president or vice president on election day, and that's around 40% back. So the fact that there are a lot of undecideds, around 17%, and 40% can still change their minds, and you can see that the growth is still, it's still a bit more fluid. That basically means that that the numbers that you see for president now can still change dramatically, depending on how the political and economic life of Filipinos will unfold in the next few months. So any declaration of certainty for the outcome of the 2028 elections is premature. And that's something that we always say. So just again, it's really that 40% can still change their minds. So soft voters pa rin sila. And then 17% are undecideds for presidency. So that means that if all of those suddenly decide to vote for Leni or for Raffy Tulfo or any of the names, Bam Aquino, Rizon Tiveros, even Sara Duterte, then that will be a game changer. And of course, those who don't identify themselves with any of the factions, these people can be the swing votes.
What could change with the numbers of Vice President Sara Duterte? Is it, well, let's take, for example, of course, we have the impeachment trial. If there is a conviction and a perpetual ban, that of course can take her out of the race completely. But how about an acquittal? Could it give her a boost? Could it give her that dominating political faction over the other groups?
So So many of the supporters of Sara Duterte are still unsure, are still soft supporters. So as a candidate, you want to make sure that the current supporters don't anymore transfer to any other candidate. So that's the first goal. The second goal is you get votes from other candidates. So support from you, hopefully they don't transfer to other groups, and then other groups transfer to you. I think that's something that that's a well of votes that any of the candidates can work on. But for Sara Duterte, I think we have that data that around 40% are soft voters of Sara Duterte, and therefore that 40% can still decide to move out and support other candidates or not vote at all. No, and the impeachment trial is exactly the opportunity of her opponents to convince these soft supporters to move out and support someone else. And so it's really uncertain, and it really depends on how each of the the participants in the impeachment trial, the people who are arguing in the Senate, how effective they communicate, how well they change the perceptions of people towards their clients or towards their side. And so I think it is a big factor, but it also depends on whether or not people actually look at and watch the impeachment trial. That's something that we need to find out, whether the reception is still huge and whether or not it's still being watched by many of the Filipinos who may vote in 2028.
There's also a part about the performance assessment of the president and the vice president. For the vice president, it's still rising. What's driving that, despite minimal activity of her as a vice president, and of course the ongoing impeachment trial?
So this is proof that performance assessments is not necessarily just about governance outputs. It can also be driven by factional support. Basically this emotional and affective attachment to a candidate, such as Duterte, and the more that she's seen as persecuted, and the more that the father is also seen as persecuted, the more sympathy that the supporters and Filipinos attached to the vice presidents. And this is something that you can see clearly with the vice president. And so performance satisfaction ratings, it's not just about intellect, it's not just about, it's not just about actual performance and output, but many times it has something to do with communication, it has something to do with affinity, it has something to do with, the emotional attachment that people have towards the candidate, towards the personality. And so I think particularly for Vice President Sara Duterte, is the fact that her family is being persecuted, seen as being persecuted in the Senate and elsewhere in other areas of legal debates, including the ICC.
One more question. Go ahead. You were going to ask.
Yeah, we've seen, all throughout, even last year, that there's really a 20-point gap between the vice president, who has a 55% approval, and the president, who has a 55%, dissatisfaction rating. So, it really talks about, it really tells you the catching up that the Marcoses will have to do in terms of how people view them, the level of legitimacy, the level of credibility that they have in terms of political leadership and economic development, and all of the things that are attached to the presidency.
Regarding the direction of the country, Dr. Robin, 68% of Filipinos believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. That is, of course, a significant increase from your previous survey of about 10 percentage points. What changed? And that was just in the past month.
Correct. So there's another slide, there's another statistic that we use to explain that, which is that there's also a 10-point increase in the frequency of economic depravity. So that means that more people experience almost daily challenges to meeting their basic needs. So it means that almost every day, the people who answered that they experience economic lack every day has increased by 10 points. So now 30% of people reported that they experienced economic hardship. And another 30% experience economic hardship 2 to 3 times a week. And so unsurprisingly, people also feel that more people feel that we're heading in the wrong direction. Now it's now almost at 70%. And I think, we've already been experiencing inflation. Plus you have the energy crisis that is a product of the Iran war. Given that this is a global structural issue, but many people believe that government, and the Philippine government, particularly under Marcos, has a big role to play in solving this problem. And it seems like, you saw that Bongbong Marcos is trying to be responsive to that particular problem. And, that's something that hopefully will continue, or else the number of people who experience hardships daily will increase, and more people will suggest that they think that the country is headed in the wrong direction. So that's one. The other thing is not just the economic activities and the economic experience that they live every day, but it's also this feeling that we're dealing with political issues in the Senate and the Congress instead of economic issues. And so again, Bongbong Marcos is trying to be a bit more responsive to that by talking about a lot of these economic responses throughout his State of the Nation address last Monday.
Doc Robin Garcia of WR Numero, thank you very much again, sir, for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Juan.